Just as Florida began recovering from the devastation of Hurricane Helene, the arrival of Hurricane Milton has brought further destruction. This isn't the first time hurricanes have changed lives forever. Let's take a deeper look into some of the worst hurricanes in history, their horrifying aftermaths, and the toll they took on those unlucky enough to be caught in their paths. On September 8, 1900, the quiet coastal town of Galveston, Texas became the stage for one of the deadliest natural disasters in U.S. history, the infamous Galveston hurricane. This storm, which made landfall as a Category 4 hurricane, packed winds exceeding 150 miles per hour and a storm surge estimated between 15 and 20 feet. It left a path of utter destruction, with over 12,000 people dead, 8,000 of whom were Galveston residents. What made this storm particularly horrifying was the lack of forewarning. No radar, satellite, or advanced communication systems existed to give residents any chance to flee. By the time the storm struck in full force, it was too late. In the early morning of September 8th, strong winds began battering the city. At first, Galveston's 36,000 residents did not think much of it. Storms weren't uncommon along the Gulf Coast, and many went about their daily lives, unaware of the doom approaching. But as noon approached, the tides rose at an alarming rate, and by afternoon, fierce waves crashed over the coastline, swallowing the streets. For the Sisters of Charity at St. Mary's Orphan Asylum, the day took a tragic turn. Sister Elizabeth Ryan, one of 10 sisters caring for 93 children, had returned from town with food, despite warnings to stay put. The storm intensified rapidly, and by late afternoon, the waves reached the orphanage, sweeping away entire sections of the building. As the waters rose, the sisters gathered all the children into one of the dormitories, tying them together with clothesline ropes in a desperate attempt to keep them from being swept away. They sang "Queen of the Waves" to calm the terrified children, but the walls couldn't hold. By 7:30 p.m., a tidal surge demolished the orphanage, dragging the sisters and children into the turbulent waters. Only 3 boys survived: William Murney, Frank Madeira, and Albert Campbell. They floated for nearly a day, clinging to debris before finding safety. Tragically, the bodies of the sisters were later found, still holding tightly to the children, fulfilling their promise not to let go. By the storm's end, the once thriving city was in ruins. Entire blocks of homes were reduced to piles of debris, and bodies were scattered throughout the wreckage. Of the city's 3,600 homes, nearly all were destroyed. Galveston, one of the wealthiest cities in the U.S. at the time, was forever changed. In the storm's aftermath, survivors faced months of misery. Decomposing bodies had to be burned on pyres to prevent disease outbreaks, and it would take years for the city to fully rebuild. The construction of the 17-foot-high Galveston seawall in 1902 marked a new chapter in the city's history, though it was too late for the thousands who had perished. Barely 2 decades later, another deadly storm tore through the southeastern United States, this time wreaking havoc around Florida's Lake Okeechobee. On September 16, 1928, the Okeechobee hurricane made landfall as a Category 4 storm, bringing winds up to 145 miles per hour. The lake, usually a tranquil body of water, became a monstrous wave machine. Its shallow waters, barely 9 feet deep, surged over fragile earthen dikes, sweeping entire communities into oblivion. This disaster left an estimated 2,500 to 3,000 dead, most of them Black migrant farm workers who lived in poverty-stricken settlements along the lake's southern shores. The morning of September 16th began with eerie calm as the eye of the hurricane approached. But by midday, winds began howling, and by the evening, the storm's fury was unleashed. Towns like Belle Glade and Pahokee, teeming with workers who had little means to evacuate, became the epicenter of destruction. Families huddled in makeshift shelters or climbed atop roofs as the lake's waters surged over the dikes, drowning everything in their path. Survivors recalled the water rising with terrifying speed, carrying away homes, livestock, and people. Many drowned while clinging to floating debris or trying to escape on foot. The floodwaters, which spread across a 75-mile-long stretch, left thousands stranded for days without food or clean water. The floodwaters receded slowly, revealing the full scale of the horror. Bodies were pulled from the lake for weeks, some never to be found. Mass graves were dug to accommodate the overwhelming number of victims, many of whom were buried anonymously. In the aftermath, Lake Okeechobee became a symbol of government failure. The inadequate dikes, hastily built in the years before, had crumbled under the storm's force, leaving communities vulnerable to the lake's wrath. It wasn't until the construction of the Herbert Hoover Dike, completed decades later, that the area saw any significant flood protection. The catastrophic power of nature seemed to know no bounds. Though hurricanes largely impact the South, there are times when the North is also hit. By the way, if you are enjoying the video, please subscribe to the channel. It helps us be able to tell more stories like these. On a crisp fall day in New England, September 21, 1938, residents were going about their day as usual. Few could have imagined that a deadly hurricane, one that would later be known as the Long Island Express, was racing toward them at 60 miles per hour. Meteorologists failed to predict its speed, and the hurricane, which had rapidly gained power in the Atlantic, made landfall on Long Island, New York, before carving a path of destruction through Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. With winds gusting over 120 miles per hour and storm surges as high as 25 feet, the storm took more than 600 lives in a matter of hours. The speed of the storm's arrival left residents unprepared. In Rhode Island, coastal communities were the first to feel its wrath. Winds uprooted trees, tore roofs off buildings, and reduced homes to matchsticks. Mrs. Helen Joy Lee, a local resident, was sitting on her porch when the sky turned an ominous shade of gray, and within moments, the wind picked up with terrifying intensity. She tried to get inside, but before she could, a towering wave struck, sweeping her and her porch into the bay. She held on to her dog and kitten as debris filled the water. The raging sea tossed her about, and at one point, she clung to a mattress floating by. Her dog was torn from her arms by the swirling waters, and although she was battered and nearly unconscious, she somehow survived, eventually climbing into the branches of a tree where she waited for help. For many others, survival wasn't possible. The Burns family, who had sought shelter in their beach cottage, were caught in the storm's fury when the storm's surge demolished the structure. Mrs. Burns and her two daughters were trapped beneath the rubble and drowned, while Mr. Burns was carried across the bay, unconscious on a piece of debris. He was miraculously rescued after washing ashore, but his family was lost forever. The devastation in the storm's wake was unimaginable. Coastal towns were utterly destroyed. Homes, boats, and even trains were swept away by the ferocious waters. In Mystic, Connecticut, the storm surge flooded the town's center, submerging streets under several feet of water. Boats that had once been moored peacefully in the harbor were now deposited in the middle of roads or smashed against buildings. Fires broke out as downed power lines ignited the soaked debris, further compounding the destruction. In total, over 57,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. More than 700 people were injured, and entire families were lost to sea. In Massachusetts, the Blue Hill Observatory recorded wind gusts of 186 miles per hour, making it one of the strongest hurricanes to ever hit New England. The financial losses were staggering, with estimates of over $308 million in damages, equivalent to more than $5 billion today. Afterward, a surge in public awareness and interest in meteorology began, leading to improvements in forecasting and disaster preparedness. But forecasting doesn't prevent government failures. Few disasters in U.S. history have left such a lasting mark as Hurricane Katrina, which struck the Gulf Coast on August 29, 2005, making landfall in New Orleans. A Category 4 storm, Katrina brought winds of up to 140 miles per hour. But the real destruction came from the water. New Orleans, a city below sea level, depended on its levee system to hold back the waters of Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River. Tragically, those levees failed, and the surge of water inundated the city, leaving entire neighborhoods underwater. The lower Ninth Ward, a predominantly low-income area, was among the hardest hit. The floodwaters rose as high as 12 feet, submerging homes and trapping thousands of residents inside. The levee failures were catastrophic, and many homes were swept away by the powerful surge. One story that gripped the nation was that of Hardy Jackson and his family, who lived in Bayou, Mississippi. Hardy and his wife Tonette had initially taken shelter in their home when the storm struck. As the floodwaters began rising quickly, the family climbed to the roof, trying to escape. Hardy held on to his wife's hand as long as he could, but the surge was too strong. Hardy's wife was swept away by the floodwaters and was missing for years. For years, the Jackson family held out hope for closure. It wasn't until 2019 that investigators identified a body found after the storm as Tonette's, buried as an unidentified Jane Doe for nearly 19 years. A dedicated team of investigators used DNA samples to finally confirm her identity. This revelation brought a sense of closure to Hardy's family, who felt she was finally able to honor both her parents. Hardy Jackson himself had passed away in 2013, never knowing for sure what had happened to his wife. As Katrina's floodwaters continued to rise, tens of thousands of people were trapped, with many seeking refuge at the Louisiana Superdome. Conditions were rapidly deteriorated, with food and water running out and reports of violence emerging. Families were torn apart, and chaos reigned inside the overcrowded dome. The response to Hurricane Katrina was widely criticized, with significant delays in federal aid and mismanagement at multiple levels of government. Rescue efforts were slow, and many survivors were left without basic necessities for days. Later investigations showed that this disaster was made much worse by the incompetent design and construction of the levees, a mixture of incompetence and corruption. In total, nearly 2,000 people lost their lives as a result of Hurricane Katrina. The damage was staggering, with more than 80% of New Orleans submerged underwater, and the economic toll reaching an estimated $125 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history. For those who survived, the trauma of the event lingered long after the floodwaters receded. Even today, parts of New Orleans, particularly the lower Ninth Ward, bear the scars of Katrina. The storm also revealed stark racial and economic inequalities, as it was largely the city's poorest and most vulnerable residents who bore the brunt of the disaster. The devastation of Hurricane Katrina was fresh in the minds of many when, just over a decade later, the Caribbean island of Puerto Rico would face a storm of its own, a storm that would leave the island forever changed. In the early hours of September 20th, 2017, Puerto Rico was thrust into chaos as Hurricane Maria, a Category 4 storm, made landfall. Winds howled at speeds up to 155 miles per hour, ripping through the island with unrelenting fury. The devastation left behind was unlike anything the people of Puerto Rico had ever seen. Maria ravaged the island, tearing roofs off homes and uprooting trees, leaving entire towns without power. The island's already fragile infrastructure crumbled in the face of the storm's force. More than 3 million people were plunged into darkness as the power grid failed in an instant. Across the island, roads became impassable as floods washed away bridges, blocked paths, and downed power lines, making it impossible for aid to reach the hardest-hit areas. Hospitals were left to operate on limited generator power, and in the absence of clean water, the threat of disease became a harsh reality. The humanitarian crisis deepened as the days stretched into weeks, and the full extent of the destruction became apparent. The human toll of Hurricane Maria was staggering. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives in the days and weeks that followed the storm, with many more succumbing due to a lack of access to medical care, food, and clean water. The elderly and those living in remote rural areas suffered the most, cut off from the resources they so desperately needed. Among the many heart-wrenching stories of survival was that of Yesenia de Jesus. At the time of the storm, Yesenia was living in Puerto Rico with her 1-year-old son Emmy, who had been diagnosed with multiple health conditions. As the storm raged outside, Yesenia did everything she could to protect her son. They sought refuge in their home, but the floodwaters began to rise rapidly. With no way to escape, Yesenia took the only action she could think of. She tied her son to her waist with a rope, hoping it would keep them together if the waters overtook them. For days, they waited in fear, trapped in their home without power, communication, or any way to know if help was coming. When rescuers finally arrived, they found Yesenia and Emmy huddled together in their attic. The aftermath of Hurricane Maria was marked by a slow and often inadequate response from the federal government, which was widely criticized for its failure to provide immediate and effective aid. For months, many Puerto Ricans lived without access to basic necessities like electricity, clean water, and medical care. The island's recovery was painfully slow, with thousands of homes still without power even a year after the storm had passed. Many residents were forced to leave the island, seeking refuge in the mainland U.S., while those who stayed behind faced a long and difficult road to recovery. In the years since Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico has continued to rebuild, though the scars left by the storm are still visible today. The hurricane exposed the fragility of the island's infrastructure, but it also revealed the strength and resilience of its people. Like Yesenia, who eventually made her way to Florida to start a new life with her son, the survivors of Hurricane Maria have worked tirelessly to rebuild their homes, their communities, and their lives. For the cities themselves, hurricanes are devastating, often requiring years before they return to normal. But for those who survive, there is no going back to before. With families and communities impacted with such loss, let's do what we can for those in need with a gained insight into what such devastation can look like.